Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Signature LinkedIn Live series. This is John Davis, and I'm excited today to have Mike Cleland with me. If you don't know Mike, he's the founder of Chartered Path, which is a performance consulting firm that services exclusively the search and staffing industry. If you've been to any SIA conferences over the last decade, you've probably run into Mike up on the main stage, as he's a frequent keynote speaker and breakout leader in the search and staffing industry. Mike is also the author of two books, Behind the Wheel and Breaking Through. Breaking Through is the new book that Mike penned with Barry Asen from SIA, and it's directly written for staffing firm executives on how to break through barriers and grow their organizations. Mike, thanks for being here today. Glad to have you.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, likewise. Well, here we are. We're in fourth quarter of 2025, and it's hard to even think about 2026 coming up around the corner. And for somebody like yourself that's been in the industry for 25 years, I don't think we've ever seen three down years in a row. And
Yeah.
so many people are asking me right now, what does 2026 hold? What can we expect in 2026? And with all your speaking and working with staffing firm owners, what's the pulse you're hearing on the street, and what guidance are you giving for 2026?
Yeah, it's been an interesting 3 years, especially since you've seen GDP growth and not staffing growth. And those two have really typically been really tethered together. And so it makes the predictions a lot more difficult in that case. So, it's interesting, like Q2 for a lot of the clients that I work with was an especially difficult quarter, especially like going into August. It was difficult, and and that's true with light industrial, IT, or whatever, and whatever segment you're in. Going into the fourth quarter, and the third quarter stabilized a little bit. There seems to be a bit of a pickup, but if you look at SIA's information, we're not looking at a massive growth. We're looking at 1 to 4% in these sectors. And the two sectors that have really been the most resilient have been locums and education. Have been consistently strong. So it's hard to know really what to expect. Even if the economy picks up, there's other things I think that are impacting demand outside of just the economy. So it should be interesting.
Yeah, we'll probably talk about that two-letter word here that starts with A and ends in I here later in our talk.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I'm curious on the education, because I've heard that as well. Why do you think that has been one of the leading metrics in staffing?
It's interesting. I don't really know why that is. I think the public funding for education still remains, strong. But even like firms that work out of Texas are doing, that have maybe not as rigorous funding for education are still doing, really well. And so we're probably talking like the K through 12 support, with, the nurses and therapists, things like that. Are doing well, and the pricing is still pretty good, right? You can still make good money. It's a very different business, RFP driven business, and it's almost maybe not quite as different as selling to the federal government, but you definitely have to go in being ready to learn how to do it differently if you're used to the commercial side.
Yeah, I've heard that with the changes at the federal administration side, with the Department of Education kind of pushing down those mandates and the ownership to the state levels, that's driving some of the demand for these staffing agencies around education. So I think that lines up with what you just said.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think whether it's going to continue to grow like it has been growing over into next year, I think is really difficult to predict. I don't necessarily have a crystal ball on any of these things when it's just a very different market. So even when you look at light industrial, you would think it's poised for some growth going into next year. But this year's been relatively difficult. So, but I think that the policies and everything else has been put into place to try to onshore, some of this manufacturing, a lot of the investments coming in. Hopefully we'll start seeing some of that increase the demand going into next year. And then of course we still have the talent problem. So even if demand goes up, it's still hard to find workers. So.
Yeah, and we're seeing some of the CHNV visa challenges that are really causing some disruption on the talent side. It seems like the mandates coming down from the federal government are changing, if not weekly, at least monthly, which
Yeah.
creates some strain, but also, for some, it's creating some opportunities to backfill that talent with qualified workers.
Yeah, whenever these kind of big decisions are being made and regs are changing, it's just the uncertainty that really kind of freezes decision making in general. So it's hard to say, the uncertainty has a certain impact, but it's hard to say what the long term, impact on, for staffing will be. Hopefully positive, long term. People are obviously concerned about the different technologies and things like that are going on, the systemic changes that are happening within the industry. But I'm hoping that long term that clients will look at talent differently and actually open the doors up to bring more contingent labor in, and actually see demand go up because of the comfort level of firms using more contract labor. That's one
Yeah.
thing I'm optimistic about, I think.
We keep hearing about the penetration rate of contract labor in the labor pool, and it does seem to be inching up, while ever so slightly. What impact has all of this had on MSP programs that have been really struggling with the decline over the last 3 years? What do you see happening in MSP world?
Yeah, the MSP world, I think, is at a bit of a crossroads in that they have an opportunity to provide a lot more value, to the customers from a workforce solution standpoint. And so whether they can make that transition from being kind of a transactional manager of spend and managing the demand and supply, just basically being logistical support, whether the MSPs can step up and become true workforce solutions, providing a wide variety of potential avenues to fill their talent needs, I think it's their next big challenge. Obviously, I mean, the demand has gone down. That's hurt the MSPs, but I think the MSPs are going to have to look at themselves a little bit differently to keep their market share and figure out different ways to provide value moving forward.
Yeah, they've got to elevate their value proposition up the value chain itself, because the table stakes are there, and with demand declining, at least over the last 3 years, they've got to look for new ways to add value. We're seeing some of that manifest in terms of data, providing data back to customers in terms of what's happening across the labor landscape. So it'll be interesting to watch some of that, some of those nuances unfold. A lot of our viewers come from direct search experience, and they dabble in the contract staffing space just a little bit. What kind of advice or guidance would you give someone who is primarily a direct hire firm and is interested in making the leap or jumping in and adding contract staffing either to their portfolio or growing contract staffing to their portfolio? What type of guidance or insight would you give a firm owner?
Yeah, I don't think it's a scenario where it's a dipping your foot in type thing. I think you have to be committed to investing not only in the personnel, but investing in the runway to really
Mm,
establish a contract practice. And it takes, it's going to take time. There are certainly relationships that you can leverage and be able to, get more of that spend from current clients and things like that if possible. But it is a different business. The operational structure a lot of times is different, a split desk versus a full desk, primarily because in contract, a lot of times an AE can bring a large volume of jobs to the table, requiring multiple recruiters to support it properly. And so, you have a different structure there. You might have, single salesperson to 1.5, 2 recruiters, and sometimes as high as 10 recruiters or more for VMS MSP. So it's just, you have to be kind of aware that the math of the business in terms of the ratio of the production teams, what's expected from the account manager, what's expected from the recruiter in terms of metrics, they're different.
yes.
And I would argue that the personnel, the temperament, the collaborative nature of contract staffing is different. So there's cultural differences to take into account as well, which is why, like, even if you look at firms that say, let's say I'm even a contract business and I decide I do primarily retail, but I want to do VMS. Well, you can do that as a single team for a little while, but eventually you have to split it off. Why? Well, the metrics are different. The personnel are
Mhm.
different. The compensation plans are different. The culture is different. The incentives are different. the relationship between sales and recruiting is different, how the workflow is different. So everything is different. And as it scales, those differences demand a greater separation to be able to scale efficiently over time. And what I always tell folks, it's like, if you go too far under the same operation, not only will you not get the momentum that you really need in terms of contract staffing, your core business will suffer as well. And so now you're in a difficult situation of having to kind of roll that back and reestablish the core business.
Well, when you think about the best customers to go sell to, would you suggest that they go to their current customers that are already buying direct hire from them and try to see if there's contract staffing at those firms?
Obviously, that's the kind of the lowest hanging fruit, depending on the relationship you have with HR and how they view staffing firms and things like that. Because you don't necessarily, if you don't think they're going to respond well to it, you need to be careful about rolling out other offerings. Mainly due to the fact that, look, clients are going to give you a shot, but also your margin for error. You just need to be careful, because you can actually damage your legacy relationships by trying to provide an offering that you're not ready for. So, yes, that is the simplest solution, but you just got to be ready that if you're given that opportunity, you got to execute.
Yeah, you got to deliver, or it could bite you back both ways, right?
Then you've hurt both businesses. Yeah.
Well, we talked a little bit earlier, alluded to anyway, AI, and now that the cat is out of the bag and some of the noise and dust has started to settle, how do you see smart firms leveraging AI to their basic business, their core business? How are they leveraging AI for the good? And maybe how are folks getting distracted and not getting the value out of AI?
Yeah, the sourcing and screening component is obviously the most obvious one. And my take on the AI is I tend to be a little bit more conservative with it, because you have all these vendors that are providing these different solutions within AI, and they do different things. And you could definitely plug those things in. If you're an organization, and if you as an executive are really comfortable with technology, and your team is really comfortable with technology, then being on the cutting edge and engaging some of these new vendors, these new providers that is providing this tech, is feasible. You can do it without a lot of disruption to your existing operations.
Right.
The firms that are more sales driven and aren't necessarily really comfortable with technology or really good with technology, part of me is like, wait till the AT adopts some of this stuff within their current workflow. And it's not going to take long. They're going to have to do it. They're going to have to vet out the technology. They're going to have to integrate it within their ATS and integrate it within your workflow. And the change management side of that is much less. It's a much smaller lift from a change management standpoint. So you don't have to be. There's a lot of urgency around this technology, but sometimes I think that is to its detriment. If you don't have AI implemented by the end of Q1, you're not going to go out of business, right? It's that kind of thing. Now, if you listen to the vendors and everybody else, it's like, oh, you got to do this, you got to do this, you got to do this now, or you're toast. I don't necessarily think that's the case. Being a laggard in this situation is not necessarily, I think, a bad thing. And I have companies right now that are deconstructing their vendors and using their own AI to actually do these things. And so I'm not really sure, when I look at all these new companies, the barrier to entry for their technology, how great is it really? Because I don't necessarily know if it's as big as is necessary for them to stay in business as a feasible long-term technology. And Bullhorn, as they always do, they tend to end up gobbling up any kind of marketplace tool that's doing really well and just integrating into their tool. So
that's great advice. Wait till it gets developed in more mainstream tools that you're already using that helps from a training and an integration standpoint. That way you get adoption, hopefully, to occur across your teams better.
Yeah, and I won't say I'm an expert in AI, but what I would say is what I've seen and how it's being used is primarily to drive recruiting productivity up. There's some folks that are investing on the sales side as well in terms of workflow, but it's pretty immature in that stage. And I was talking to somebody at a conference, and they were talking about all these different AI tools that were going to make their recruiters more productive. But I asked them, I said, well, if you had to make a new investment and that investment could increase sales productivity by 25% or recruiting productivity 25%. Where would you put your money? He goes, oh, for sales. So then why are we having this conversation? I think it's the other thing that's happening is it's allowing people not to have the difficult conversations they need to be having in terms of the capabilities of their sales organization. Because right now, I think that's the biggest opportunity for improvement is sales. So just because a tool's there and it makes one side of your organization more productive does not mean that's what you need. Like you need to look at what you need, regardless of all the new toys that are currently out there.
Yeah, it's sometimes I think recruiters are guilty of wanting to shy away from the basics that get firms where they are, the basics that really truly drive the business, and think that the next shiny object's going to save the day or going to create some great new algorithm to make their jobs easier and better. And there may be some incremental lift there, but what I hear you saying is the basics are the basics, and they still drive the bus as it relates to productivity.
I think AI will make us a more tech-enabled service, but it's not going to replace the human in the loop, so to speak, that kind of term that's floating around now. And so understanding, what the roles need to look like and things like that is going to be really important. But again, if I look at most firms, I'm talking to most firms, they don't have enough job orders.
Right.
So it's like, and building a sales force is really hard. And there is no tool that can fix that.
No, not yet anyway. Not yet.
Yeah.
So thinking about the drag on the labor market over the last 3 years, how have you seen that affect M&A activity? Is it more of a buyer's market? And if so, what type of activity are you seeing occur? And what do you see coming up over the next 3 to 6 months? If I'm a firm owner, what can I expect in terms of M&A activity?
Yeah, I think that it's definitely shifted that way. Now, whether it's, all the way on the other side of the pendulum, I don't think that's necessarily the case, unless you're able to identify a bunch of cash-strapped firms, which I think, going into next year, especially if next year starts slow, at least some of the chatter that I'm hearing is that M&A activity will go up substantially next year, that they expect the activity numbers to go up. Obviously that's speculation, but you have to ask yourself, if I'm retirement age and I have a staffing firm and I have this technology that's making all these changes and these systemic changes to the industry, and it's untethered from GDP, making it more unpredictable. Am I ready to put the chips down for another 3 to 5 years to try to increase the value of the firm, or do I cash out? But I know what I actually have and be able to walk away. So there's an assumption there that there's going to be an increase in activity, M&A, going into next year.
That's what we're hearing on the street as well, and trying to stick to what your core is, what made you great, and magnify that right now without getting too distracted with, kind of to your point, all these shiny objects. There's been a rise in the fractional gig worker. We hear about that a lot, project-based work. You've seen some of the M&A activity that has actually taken place with tech tools in that space. Is there a play that fractional or gig workers, is there a play that staffing firms can leverage in this space, or do you see that being distinctly different?
I think it's different. I haven't really thought much about that specifically, so I don't know if I have a thorough opinion, on that, John, to be honest with you. But I think in general, the sense is that I think you're going to see more fractional work, but I think that fractional work lends itself really nicely to platform-based engagements. So, if I'm looking for a CFO, I can go onto a platform and be able to find a fractional CFO. So I think what's really going to change things a lot, and what I always tell people is if you want to know where staffing is really headed and the impact of the platforms and the impact of agents and things like that, watch platform adoption in the healthcare industry. Because so it's for the last 2 or 3 years, it's been relatively flat, but it's also probably one of the more advanced segments in terms of platforms. Once that starts going, if that starts really, the adoption rate starts ticking back up again pretty aggressively, what that indicates to me is that not only are clients more comfortable going to platforms to fulfill those needs, but some of these platforms could very well be enabled by agents that assist them through the process. that to me is kind of the biggest disruption that I'm keeping an eye on, is whether agents, how much can agents truly replace people? And if it can, then that makes the platforms a much bigger competitor, I think, for that type of work, as well
That makes
as
a lot of sense.
contract staffing. Yeah.
On both sides of that equation, being more comfortable with that platform, executing on the platform, and really living and breathing in that. And what makes healthcare kind of a leading indicator on that?
I think the work that I did, obviously, in travel nurse, and with COVID and everything else, that I obviously grew immensely, from their platform, and that the adoption of that was fantastic. So, but I think that there's a reason for it too. If you look at the variables, you have a professional staff that in terms of the folks that you're trying to place, for the most part, are professionals that are comfortable with technology. At least the younger generations are comfortable with technology. The skill sets are very predictable. So what I mean by that is, like, I'm a nurse that's licensed in X in this, versus IT, where you might have a litany of like 20 skill sets that could be involved, and you're trying to figure out different things. The amount of variability within a healthcare skill set is pretty easy to manage. So if that's the case, because there's not a lot of variability, a match is much easier. You're basically looking at licensing and location. So I think that's the other part of it. But then, I had an opportunity to work with a platform a while back, and they definitely saw a generational impact. Like, the younger nurses, the younger folks are much more willing, and this is obviously common sense, to engage in the technology. Sure. There's some pushback, supposedly, they're saying, from like the up and coming workforce, that they want a more personal touch. But I just think it's more established, it's easier to scale. And I think those firms have built a business model, a really robust business model around it, and they're going to be the first to invest in agents to enable those tools to do more for clients. So that's why I always look at healthcare.
That makes total sense. So maybe not Uberized quite yet, but in healthcare, at least the platform being more mature, the adoption being greater, and the simplicity of the skill sets being more structured, all lend themselves to maybe accelerating in that space, which makes
and if it doesn't accelerate and the proportions still stay where they are, then it's like, okay, maybe this stuff is kind of overrated in terms of what platforms can actually do. Platforms are the platforms are the disruptor, and enabling those and what they can do that's the thing to look out for, in my opinion. Everything else is about efficiency and stuff like that, which is fine, but structurally, that's the big threat.
Makes sense. Well, we're coming up to the end of our session, so I want to imagine right now we were talking to a firm owner that has had their firm for 10 years. They've experienced these last 36 months. They've seen the trials and tribulations of what's going on in the labor market. What advice or guidance would you give this firm owner to make sure that they really focus on in the coming new year? What basic advice and guidance would you make sure that they walked away with, so they were set up for the best success they can have in 2026?
I would say, resist the temptation to just grab any kind of business that you can and focus on what you're good at. And I know that can be difficult, and in times where the demand's not there. But you have to make sure that you have a really robust sales organization that is actually pursuing business within your niche, so you can control your own destiny. That to me would be the biggest thing, because if you don't have that, you are going to take just what you get. And short term, it can feed your gross profit line. That's fine. But long term, it can dilute the value of your firm, because if you don't stand for, if I can't identify exactly what you do well, why would I buy you? Right. So I think that having real clarity in terms of your niche and protecting that niche and making sure you're really, really driving towards developing that, I think, is incredibly important.
Wow. Great advice. Don't get too enamored with something that just shows up that's not in your niche, and get enamored with the top line revenue, because it could dilute everything.
Well, and that's the thing, right? If you have a strong sales force and you're intentionally going out and getting business in your core business, distraction once in a while, it's not going to kill you. But if you don't, you will eventually become dependent on opportunities that fall in your lap, and that is not a strategy.
Wow. It makes total sense. Mike Cleland, words of wisdom. Where can we see you next? What's the next
I'll be session? I'll be at the Healthcare Summit. I'm on a panel there on sales at the last day, and I'll also be at Executive Forum. So I'm basically at all the SIA all at the SAA conferences. So yeah, if you're going to executive forum or healthcare, yeah, feel free to look me up.
We'll definitely look for you there. Mike, thanks for taking time today. We'll see you at the next SAA forum. Thanks for being here.
All right. Thanks, John.
Take care.
Bye-bye.